Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online presentations and interviews with guest speakers, such as tonight, as well as classes and study groups. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science and consciousness and spirituality and philosophy and healing. We've been doing this since 2003. And in 2020, we began recording our presentations on Zoom. And our video recordings are viewable through our website, caritascenter.org, and also on our YouTube channel, which is relatively new. About a year and a half, maybe ago, we started our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on support of our members and donors to keep our program going. So if you enjoy our presentations and would like to support this program, you can make a donation or become a member by going to our website and enjoy the benefits of membership. So now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker, Gregory Shushan, Ph.D. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah, close enough. Shushan.
Shushan. Oh, okay. Gregory Shushan is an award-winning author and the leading authority on near-death experiences and the afterlife across cultures and throughout history. His books include The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife, Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, and Near-Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations, which is forthcoming in 2024. He's a visiting research fellow at the University of Winchester, research fellow at the Parapsychology Foundation, and adjunct professor of Thanatology at Marian University. Dr. Shushan was previously Perrott-Warrick researcher at University of Oxford's Ramsey Centro for Science and Religion, scholar in residence at the Centro, Incontri, Umani, Ascona, Switzerland, and honorary research fellow at the Religious Experience Research Center, University of Wales, TrinitySaint David. He has lectured at universities in the UK, Ireland, Switzerland, and the US, has given numerous talks on his research in 9 countries, and has appeared on the History Channel. So welcome, Gregory. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks for inviting me.
Okay. So whenever you're ready.
Okay.
I'll take care of that.
Okay, I'll just go into sharing my slideshow here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay. So I'll just, I'm sure everybody knows, everyone here knows what a near-death experience is, but there is sometimes there's some confusion about the term. What it's not is a lot of people will say, oh, I had a near-death experience. I was, trained to cross the street and I almost got hit by a bus, and I'll be waiting like, and the and never comes. So a lot of people think it means like you have a close call with death. But what it's commonly known as I'm sure you all know, is you actually come close to death, or you even die temporarily. And then you have these sensations during that time when you're supposed to be dead or you're unconscious, of your soul leaving your body, traveling to another realm, encountering a being of light, meeting deceased relatives, various kinds of spiritual experiences where you feel like you're have universal knowledge about the universe, and then you're either sent back to your body or you find yourself back in your body spontaneously, and you wake up, and then you're able to tell about these experiences, which appear to have been of an afterlife realm. So in the most basic sense, as I wrote on the slide, the spontaneous which is important to clarify that it's spontaneous in contrast to other types of experiences that seem to give access to the other world, like with shamanic journeying or psychedelic drug use or whatever. NDEs are the only ones that are spontaneous, that we don't court them normally anyway. They seem to be universal, and there are very few elements that are truly universal and cross-cultural, despite the fact that they occur universally. So the most common are the soul leaves the body, darkness, light, and these very kind of general impressions, and then has these sorts of spiritual episodes. These are some of the most common features of near-death experiences. And again, depending on the culture, not all of these will actually manifest in everybody's NDE, and even depending on the individual. So no two NDEs are exactly alike, even if it's two evangelical Christians or two Reformed Jews or two Shaivite Hindus or whatever. So there's individual elements, there's cultural elements, and there's universal elements, which are all kind of intermeshed and interentangled, as will become clear throughout this talk. I know of near-death experiences from every one of these areas of the world. They basically occur all around the planet, and they're known from the earliest times of recorded history up until now. They're recorded by in various different contexts, so in religious contexts, in explorers, missionaries, even documentary, official political contexts in the ancient world, medical, if I didn't already say that. So it's not just that they're occurring in one particular part of the world in one particular type of document or literary text. They're kind of just spread out everywhere. It's almost like there's this undercurrent of NDEs that's behind religion and culture for centuries, millennia, and it's been a little bit ignored because I'm sure you've all know about Raymond Moody. He was the sort of founding father of near-death studies. In 1975, he wrote his book, Life After Life, and he actually named near-death experience. Before Moody, there was no name for this phenomenon. It was, depending on whichever culture they appeared in. So, it might be a visionary experience of the afterlife or return from death experience or whatever. But it really took Moody's codifying it and naming it to bring it into like a formal form of study in the 20th century and now 21st century. So after Moody, there was this kind of determination to identify exactly what a near-death experience is, and Moody listed 15 or however many elements there were of this type of element. And he also acknowledged that they occur cross-culturally. He found a couple from different parts of the world. He mentioned the myth of from Plato and Plato's Republic, where a soldier dies and comes back to life and describes a narrative which has a lot of things in common with near-death experiences, but also is very much a Greek culturally embedded thing, and it's very, very long, and it's obviously intended for Plato to make a point about his own spiritual and philosophical ideas. And Moody also noticed that in medieval Europe, there were some examples of return from death journeys where a monk or a nun would die and come back to life and tell the story of what happened in between. These are all the sort of foundations for Dante's Inferno, which is, a famous text of basically a literary near-death experience that goes on through a series of very long poems. But what was missing was, so Moody starts this, and then Bruce Grayson tries to further codify it, and he comes out with a thing called the Grayson scale, where he has, there are all these elements that combine to make a near-death experience. So Alan Kelleher and James McLennan start finding more cross-cultural near-death experiences. They find a few in ancient medieval China, a few in indigenous societies, and there's this real kind of drive to come to what are the universal elements that make up a near-death experience. So basically, what do these experiences share in common all throughout the world that makes them the same kind of experience? And the sort of frustrating and disappointing, but also really fascinating point is it's impossible to do that. There are basically no sub-experiences that are truly universal that make up what we think of as an NDE. So in other words, I look at it as like there's this repertoire of maybe 25 or 30 sub-experiences that different people draw from wherever, and those things, when brought together, make up an NDE. So just a very quick example of that, in the West, the sort of general idea of an NDE is that we leave the body, we rush through darkness in a tunnel, and we come out into another world. In small-scale societies, tribal societies around the world, in the Pacific and Native Americans and so on, there's no tunnel. They don't rush. They actually walk along a path, and they even will describe, they'll say, I was walking along the sandy path and I saw the footsteps of thousands of other spirits that had been on this road before me. So the concept is the same. They're still transitioning out of the body from this world to the next world, but they're just walking along a path instead of rushing through a tunnel. Another good example is the reason for coming back to the body is generally in the Western NDE stereotypes that we're familiar with. Somebody is told that you need to go back and care for your ailing mother, or you need to go back and raise your children, or possibly some kind of spiritual educational purposes. You haven't fulfilled your potential in life. You need to go back and write that book or whatever it is. But in a lot of other societies, in China and a few in India, a couple in small-scale societies, it's a case of mistaken identity. So rather than being told that I have some purpose to fulfill, I'll go to the other world and I'll be told, uh-oh, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan. We wanted the one who lives in Persia, or whatever. So go back to your body and we're going to go get this other guy. And then I would wake up in my body and report my NDE. So again, being sent back to your body by a sort of spiritual being and returning to the body and waking up, that's all apparently universal in the most general terms, but the reason for it is very culturally determined. So it took near-death studies a long time, kind of 50 years to really grapple with this problem. And I'll come back to it later, but it has really important implications for how we interpret NDEs, whether we see them as just like epiphenomena of a dying brain. Is this just like our brain is in crisis and it starts creating these special effects? Or is it genuinely a glimpse of the afterlife? And I'll get back to that later on. But it's just, what happened was the whole problem got oversimplified on both sides, because everyone is saying, are NDEs true? How can we find out if they're true? And so they're, first of all, ignoring a lot of non-Western examples. And then second of all, trying to, even when they did start discovering them, trying to fit them into a Western model, which doesn't really work. So we need to broaden our perspective of near-death experiences. And so for that reason, my only criteria of what a near-death experience is that within the culture, if they believe that the person died, and they had experiences of some, spiritual or supernatural form during that period of death or near death, and came back to tell about it, to me, that's a near-death experience. What they actually describe, I'm not here to judge that. So yeah, that's where I kind of try to negotiate the problem. I accept what the cultures are saying, and kind of take them at face value. So to test this, my first study, the one on ancient religions, which is coming out next year in a new edition, what I did was I wanted to kind of figure out the degree to which afterlife beliefs around the world reflected near-death experiences, because we don't really have a lot of accounts of near-death experiences from ancient religions. So I looked at their actual beliefs to see if their beliefs mirror a near-death experience symbols and phenomena, then maybe we can speculate that their beliefs were actually based on that kind of experience. So for example, with ancient Egypt, I was looking at the pyramid texts and coffin texts and the Book of the Dead and so on. And they describe, where they're sort of predicated on the person, they're directed or written for the person who's dead, and they're instructions on what to do in the afterlife. So we can kind of, it's a lot of complicated esoteric language and descriptions, but we can kind of tease out of it that essentially the soul leaves the body, travels through darkness in the form of various gates and underground caves and things, goes to another realm, which is illuminated by the sun, it's a realm of light, and they meet the sun god, Re, who is a being of light, which is obviously very common in NDEs. This being of light kind of assists in the process of judgment, along with various other gods. Deceased relatives are met in the other world. And there is an interesting episode where the soul of the dead encounters the corpse of Osiris, who is the god of death, the god of the underworld, and also the god of rebirth. And the person is associated with the corpse of Osiris in the way that basically there's a transformation that takes place at death, where the dead person is the god of the underworld, and therefore they're encountering their own corpse in the other world, which to me, I think is probably a symbolic expression of when somebody has an NDE and they leave their body and they see their corpse lying there. And that's what makes them think, wow, that's me. I'm no longer that body. I'm out of the body. And that's their realization that they've survived their own death, essentially. And in the ancient Egyptian text, encountering that dead god in the other world is basically the realization that allows them to proceed to the next level in the other world. So it's thematically the same, it's kind of descriptively the same, even though we have all these different gods, they're different names, and names for paradise like the field of rushes and all these very specific culturally manifested things that nevertheless kind of embody all the basic, or a lot of the basic near-death experience terminology and symbols. So in Egypt, there were no descriptions of near-death experiences because they just didn't have that. They didn't use writing for those purposes. They used it for religion and for documentary or documentation in the sense of bureaucracy, essentially priestly things, laundry lists, divorce decrees, but they didn't have like personal narratives of, this crazy thing happened to me the other day. So from what we can tell, even though it's a myth, the very first actual historical near-death experience might be from the Epic of Gilgamesh, who is a Mesopotamian king. Even though it's a myth, and it's actually in a text called the Death of Bilgamesh, even earlier than the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient Sumerian text. And it describes, let's see if I can find here. So Bilgamesh was actually, as far as we know, he seems to have been an actual historical king. So, and that's why I think that he might have the very first, earliest documented near-death experience. The text tells of how he traveled to the underworld while his body was lying on its deathbed. So it's clear that he didn't go there in bodily form. It wasn't like, a journey like Ulysses or something. His body's on the deathbed, and he's instructed, don't enter the underworld with an angry heart. And then he undergoes a life review, which is assisted by various deities. And the deities are described as radiating light. So once again, these beings of light kind of effecting the life review or the review of the person's deeds on earth. And they review his life, and they determine that, because he founded temples and he lived a good life and he followed religious customs, he was then able to proceed to the realm of paradise. So evaluation and judgment of a person's life is practically universal, but the things that determine a positive or negative afterlife are very much cultural. So if I had a near-death experience, I very much doubt that they would say they would judge me on whether I performed religious rituals correctly or not. but that's a very important thing in ancient India and ancient Sumer and various other cultures. Another interesting example is from the ancient Indian text called the Vedas. This is particularly from the Katha Upanishad, and it's a famous dialogue between the god of the underworld Yama and a little boy named Nachiketas. It's an interesting story because the boy is annoying his father by asking him a bunch of questions. You know, he's saying, "Oh, what happens when you die?" and just these kind of unanswerable questions. And his father gets so annoyed with him that he basically says, you know, he sends him to the underworld, is how the text describes it, which essentially means, you know, he kills him. So the boy goes to the underworld of Yama and he's left unattended for 3 days. Yama has a lapse in hospitality and he forgets that, or he doesn't realize the boy's there. And so when he comes back and he says, "Oh my God, you poor kid, you've been sitting here for 3 days. I'm going to grant you 3 wishes." So the boy wishes firstly for his father's kindness, which is quite poignant considering that his father just sent him to the underworld to begin with for you know, being too annoyed with him. The second is that he wants the secrets of the fire altar, which is you know, a ritual, another sort of making sure that he's doing ritual correctly. But then the third is that he wants the secrets of immortality. But it turns out that those last two are pretty intertwined because the fire altar, the quote is, "It leads to heaven, to the attainment of an endless world." And Yama tells him that it's this place of merriment where there's no fear, there's no hunger or thirst, no sorrow, no old age. So it's this kind of very positive, heavenly sort of realm. He tells him that that death doesn't exist, and he also explains the concept of Atman and Brahman, which is a very important concept in Hinduism, and essentially that there's no distinction between them. And what that means is that the Atman is like the inner unchanging self that's the same in everybody. It's the thing that makes me me from the time I'm born until the time I die. Whereas Brahman is the sort of universal consciousness, the ultimate reality of which we're all a part. But the lesson that Yama is giving to Nachiketas is that there's no distinction between those two. Atman is Brahman. We are all this, you know, universality, even though we're still individuals. So it's the realization of your oneness within the divine, essentially, which again is a very common kind of theme in near-death experiences when people say that they felt this oneness and this universal totality with everything. That I should say, it's again, it's in a religious text. It's not presented as a near-death experience. The first one that seems to be an actual unambiguously documentary context for a near-death experience is from ancient China from around 500 BCE. And what's interesting about it, it deals with a provincial ruler, a local ruler named Qianzi. But embedded within the account of his near-death experience, there's another one of another minor ruler called Mu of Xin, which is from 150 years earlier. So potentially we have the earliest documentary NDE at around 650 or 620 BCE. And both of the accounts focus on the prophetic information which is given to these rulers in the other world. And I'm going to come back to that later, but this is a good example to kind of lay the foundation of that. And one of them also features an encounter with the soul of a child who the NDEer meets later in life. And this is known as a peak in Darien experience. It's a kind of obscure label for meeting people not known to have died. So essentially, if you die and encounter somebody, let's say you go or you have a near-death experience and you meet your uncle in the other world, and for all you know, your uncle's alive, you saw him yesterday, and then you come back to life and you know your aunt tells you, "I'm sorry, Uncle Bob died while you were dead." So it's this kind of evidential thing where you meet somebody that you didn't know had died, and then you come back and it's verified. So this ancient Chinese example contains that, and I'll just kind of tell the story a little bit because it's pretty interesting. So Qianxi apparently dies, but the text, before we get his near-death experience, the text first says, in bygone times, the ruler Mu of Sin was in a similar state. He died and he awoke on the seventh day, and he said, I went to the residence of the Emperor of Heaven, and I greatly enjoyed myself. I've been absent so long because I had something to learn there. The state of sin, of which he was the ruler, the emperor said to me, will suffer great turmoils. The succession of the ruling class will be disturbed. There will be a usurper coming. So it was basically these political and dynastic revelations that he gave him, and these warnings. So that's basically the extent of the NDE. And the text states that all of these things actually did come to pass. So even though it's very brief, it's also really interesting because, for one thing, it has some of, the bare outlines of some of the NDE elements. But for the other thing, it's very much used in the service of a political justification for the line of accession in ancient China. So the text then goes back to Qianxi, the first person that it was talking about who had the NDE, which was contemporary with the text being written. And it quotes him as saying, I went to the residence of the Emperor of Heaven, where I enjoyed myself. There was a host of gods or spirits, and I wandered about in the all-ruling heaven, the music in 9 tunes, resounding far and wide, with accompaniment of 10,000 dances, was other than the music of that of the 3 dynasties, and its tunes moved my heart. And then it gets a little bit surreal. A bear came up and was going to grasp me, and the emperor told me to shoot it, and I hit it, and it was dead. Then came a spotted bear, and this beast too I shot down. And because he was successful in killing these 2 bears, the emperor gave him these 2 baskets with these sets of objects in them. And then he assigns him a dog on Earth. He says, I'm going to give you this dog that your sons will have. And then it again becomes this very sort of almost a setup for it to be validated later on, which is what it turns out to be. So, and then also next to the emperor, he sees a child standing there, and it's a child that he's never seen before. So then when he comes back to life and he tells of his NDE years later, he's out walking on the street, and a mysterious man is blocking his path, and he won't move out of his way. And then suddenly Qianxi realizes, I've seen this person before, but he couldn't quite remember who he was. So the guy tells him, when you were ill, when you were dead, basically, I was standing at the emperor's side. I was that child who was there. And so Qianxi then asks him, well, what did you see? And the boy, who's now grown up as a man, says, I saw you killing a bear. I saw the emperor promising to give your sons a dog. I saw him prophesy these political events. And so the text ends, Qianxi committed this event to writing and deposited it in the archives. And that's basically to tell us this was true, this actually happened. And it makes a point of saying that all of the prophecies in the text also came true. And because those predictions came true, that validated the reality of near-death experiences, essentially, for the ancient Chinese. And the ancient Chinese historians in the text affirmed their belief in the genuineness of these kinds of experiences. So before I continue with more examples, this is a good example of what's called the experiential source hypothesis, which is that different kinds of supernatural beliefs, in this case the NDE, leads to changes in religious beliefs, or leads to certain types of religious beliefs. And in this case, the argument is that near-death experiences are responsible, or at least greatly contribute to afterlife beliefs around the world. Now, this idea has a pretty long pedigree. There's quite a few scholars from the past who talked about, they didn't call it the experiential source hypothesis, but they did kind of recognize that NDEs, or that afterlife beliefs and different kinds of supernatural beliefs are grounded in different kinds of supernatural experiences. So going all the way back to 1871, E.B. Tyler wrote, "Men whose spirits, traveling in the hallucinations of extreme illness to the land of the dead, have returned to reanimate their bodies and tell us what they have seen." So 1871, that's more than 100 years before Raymond Moody discovered, quote unquote, discovered near-death experiences. And then Andrew Lang, who is the author of the fairy books you might know of, he wrote the Green Fairy Book, the Gray Fairy Book. He was a 19th century fairy tale writer and scholar. He also reached similar conclusions just by reading and observing accounts of experiences of the afterlife alongside actual beliefs in an afterlife from around the world. So in other words, again, the term near-death experience dates back to 1975, but people have been having these experiences for much longer. Anthropologists have been particularly astute in identifying this experiential source phenomena. In the 1950s, Ake Hultkrantz, who's a very famous Swedish anthropologist, he mostly worked on Native American cultures and religions, and he found that the indigenous people themselves in North America, they distinguish between visionary experiences that occurred during rituals or drug use, between dreams, and between spontaneous near-death experiences. So it's not just a case of scholars and outsider anthropologists imposing these categories on them. They actually had these categories themselves, and they put near-death experience in the highest category of importance and value as far as the meaning and what they could learn from them. And so he concluded that Native American afterlife journey myths were inspired by religious experiences, and these basic experiences have been constantly renewed within the frame of religious life. So what he means by that is they have these NDEs, and then they each time somebody else has an NDE, it reinforces those kinds of beliefs. And then Irving Hallowell also stressed that these are not just general mythological ideas, and they're not just some legends of some random people in the past, like Gilgamesh might be. He said they can't be viewed as simple dogmas that gain currency without appeal to observation and experience. And he stressed that specific individuals are referred to whose historicity is not in question. When I made inquiries about life after death, it was the alleged experiences of these individuals that were first mentioned. So they're basically saying, he would say, what do you believe in an afterlife, and why do you believe it? And they would say, we believe this, this, and this, and we know because this particular person went there and told us. And then what's interesting about this experiential source phenomena is it's not predicated on near-death experiences being true or not. All it's predicated on is people actually having them. So, for example, Thomas Metzinger is a neuroscientist, and he's very much a skeptic, and he doesn't actually believe that out-of-body experiences are what they appear to be. He thinks it's a neurophysiological phenomenon. But he said, for anyone who actually had that type of experience, it's almost impossible not to become an ontological dualist afterwards. In all their realism, cognitive clarity, and general coherence, these experiences almost inevitably lead the experiencing subject to conclude that conscious experience can, as a matter of fact, take place independently of the brain and the body. And he says the narratives of these experiences must be taken seriously, even though their interpretations of them are misguided or mistaken, which I think is really interesting, because he's willing to accept that out-of-body experiences are occurring and people are basing their beliefs on them, which is a huge step in the history of religions, basically. But he's not willing to accept that they actually left their bodies. He's basically saying it's a trick of the brain. And there have been other studies. There was a study of a guy named Dean Shields in the 70s. He reviewed 67 small-scale societies around the world, and found that 95% of them believed in out-of-body experiences happening for various reasons, often related to death. And he concluded, when different cultures are reporting this very similar type of experience, we kind of have to think that maybe they're actually having that experience, which might sound, like a pretty obvious thing, but it's an uphill battle in this kind of subject. So any questions so far? I might just pause there for a while and.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What does ontological dualist mean?
Oh, sorry. That essentially means that dualist is the dualism of the body and the spirit or consciousness. Consciousness is probably a better word. And ontological just is basically what is the true nature of the reality of it. So it's basically saying it's almost impossible for someone to not believe that the soul is separate from the body and can survive death. That's the English translation. So, any other questions so far, or
Anybody have a question?
I have a quick question. Well, your last word, last three words was that is a big battle or something like this. What are the barriers that, as a researcher, you find from journals or societies to embrace these ideas or to embrace these facts?
Yeah, that's a good question. My field was or is history of religions. I started out actually in archaeology and Egyptology, and then I moved to history of religions. And in that world, actually the official name is the study of religions, but since I'm historian, I alter it a little bit. But in religious studies, there's a real distinction between theology and religious studies, and they want to be seen as like totally objective, non-religious, and it's up to the theologians who are studying their own religions to talk about truth claims. Religious studies people are more like anthropologists or sociologists, where it's just finding reasons why people believe the things they do. So in that field, because there's such a chip on their shoulder about not being theologians, anything that's seen as universal or mystical, or both, if something is seen as a universal mystical experience, it can't exist, because the argument is everything is culturally generated. There can be no such kind of experience that we can call religious. So this work that I'm doing proves it wrong, as far as I'm concerned. It's just completely, when I have dozens of examples of people saying we changed our belief because we had this experience, and when we know that this experience occurs, it's obvious that you can't say no to that, but they do, and they say, this is they call it crypto-theology, that you're smuggling mysticism or theology into religious studies, which is so it's an uphill battle. and strangely, anthropology is a little bit more open. Archaeology was more open, but religious studies, because of that historical background of the discipline, they make a big issue out of it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So you really, you shouldn't say religious experience. You should say experiences deemed religious. There's kind of these various hoops to jump through that to qualify your language, so you kind of make sure that you're not being seen as a crypto theologian, which I'm not anyway. I'm just I'm looking at it from I'm not looking at it as somebody who is a religious person trying to promote a particular kind of belief. I'm kind of looking at it from the outside too. So,
well, you're looking at the evidence.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's what frustrates them, is because there's somebody who's looking at the evidence, who's trained to look at the evidence, and I have a scholarly background, and I'm not promoting a certain view, but nevertheless, I'm saying things that they don't want to hear.
Right. Right. I was thinking that in these days, there's so many more NDEs being reported because of the advances of resuscitative techniques. So we're
Absolutely.
resuscitating more people, so we have more accounts. Whereas the farther back you go, the harder it is to find the accounts, the reports of these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And also a difficulty is that from the older accounts, we don't have any way of telling whether the person was clinically dead for a time or not. All we can do is, take the word of the people that were around them or the person who was writing about it.
Yeah, because you mentioned in your book, which, by the way, I forgot to hold up when I introduced you. This is this is one of Gregory's books and the one that I just finished reading. But there are accounts where people are dead for several days and their bodies are already starting to rot and they come back.
Right. Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing that occurs across cultures. I'm not totally sure I believe them, and I wonder if it was a way of accentuating the miraculousness of the occurrence, and like that this is evidence. This is such a miracle that somebody who was even started to decompose was able to come back to life. Because I don't know if it's biologically possible for that to
I
happen.
don't either. That's what I was wondering when
Yeah.
I thought, is it possible?
Yeah, but it's interesting that there's quite a few of them like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and from medieval Europe as well as from the Pacific or wherever. So
Yeah.
I'll look at
Can I ask a personal question?
Sure.
How did you get interested in near-death experiences? Because with your scholarly background, you could have gone in many different directions.
Yeah. Partly was when I was doing Egyptology, and it was fascinating. I loved it, but I just wanted to. I didn't want to be stuck in that narrow single culture discipline kind of field. And I was thinking, okay, now that I know this afterlife mythology and ideas and literary texts of Egypt, what did they believe in ancient India? And I just kind of wanted to expand it. So it was partly a just interest, just kind of scholarly interest and personal interest and not wanting to get bored. But it was also, I first learned about near-death experiences when I was pretty young, and it just fired my imagination up. I was always interested in, paranormal stuff and ghosts and books about strange phenomena, which I had when I was pretty young. I had an aunt who was a Rosicrucian, and so she'd give me Lapsang Rampa books and all this books about witchcraft and all this. So it was always kind of interesting to me. And then when I read Carol Zaleski's book, Otherworld Journeys, that's a book about medieval afterlife texts in relation to near-death experience. That kind of stimulated it more. And then reading the Egyptian texts reminded me of the Zaleski book. And I kind of thought, okay, how far can we take this, relationship between NDEs and afterlife beliefs? And it just snowballed from there. And it's now been like 20 something years. Just crazy. So okay, so I'll continue on. This is an illustration by a Kiowa Native American prophet named Bianchi, who later, after his near-death experience, became known as the messenger. And he was able to actually visit the afterlife realm as a shaman in order to obtain knowledge or information for his people in the other world. That's one of the main reasons. One of the main functions of Native American shamanism was to get information or knowledge from spirits in the other world. So we're not sure entirely how he generated these experiences, and some of them actually seem to be actual NDEs, but some of them are deliberately non-spontaneous shamanic type NDE experiences. So in one of them, he described traveling across a plain of buffalo and ponies until he reached the spirit village, which is shown in this picture that he actually drew. Illustrations of NDEs are rare in any culture, so I love this picture. It's really amazing. He met 4 women who he knew in life, and they arrived on horseback with sacks of wild plums and there they are in the picture. They told him where he could find his deceased brothers. So then he goes to this other area of the village where he meets his deceased brothers, and he joins them in a buffalo hunt. And then he returned the way he came. And on the way, he met what he described as two curious beings. And in a different drawing, he drew them as oh no, here they are. Actually, in the middle, you can see below that circle, there's these two triangles. Those are the two curious beings, which were green triangular figures with crosses at the top. Now, he already knew about Christianity, so there seems to be some kind of Christian and native syncretism of belief going on, manifested within his experience. And then as he continues on, he comes to the ghost dance circle, which is that circle right in the middle there. And that's where he met a woman that he knew on Earth, and he met other relatives in this teepee village that's above the ghost dance circle. He saw his father, his siblings, children, and other people who had died before him. They offered him food, but he refused it. And as soon as he refused it, he woke up back on the mountain where he had gone into his near-death trance. There's lots and lots to unpack in this very brief account. That last part, there is a cross-cultural thing, including in ancient Greece, that if you eat something in the other world, you have to remain there. That crops up all over the place, which is a really interesting and strange thing, because no near-death experiencer that I know of in modern times has ever said that they were, offered a Pop-Tart or a Big Mac, and if they ate it, they couldn't come back. I've never heard that in So what's interesting about this is, first of all, on the left, there's another picture that Bianchi drew of his near-death experience. It's really difficult to figure out what exactly is going on there, but this area at the top, to me, kind of seems like it could be, these lines converging, dark lines converging into these stars. Maybe that's like a tunnel with light. Down below, I'm not sure if that's part of the ghost dance circle or what, but this figure at the bottom standing on a rainbow looks like a Christ type figure, and he has a cross on his head, and he's kind of radiating this strange energy or something. And unfortunately, all it says in the actual manuscript is drawing of his vision of the spirit world. So there's definitely spirit beings there. There's some kind of deity. And it was originally drawn on different sheets of paper. These are 3 stuck together. So I kind of wonder if it was depicting different stages of the journey, and it was kind of put together in this way. And then the other thing that's really fascinating about this, going back to the experiential source hypothesis idea, is that's Bianchi himself on the right, and he's holding this picture and possibly some other picture attached to it. And he is giving a lesson to his people about the nature of the afterlife. So he's referring to his own near-death type experience or possible shamanic experience, and his drawing of it as a kind of, here's exhibit A, and this is what happens at this stage of the afterlife. And literally teaching his people about, religious beliefs about the afterlife based on his own experiences, which obviously were very much influenced by his culture, because we have the ghost dance circle and we have teepees and all these other things, but then we have this Christianized figure at the bottom. I like that picture so much, by the way. I used it on the cover of my second book, and you can see the people at Oxford University Press enhanced it, the colors and the contrast, so you can see it a little bit more clearly, what's going on there. And actually, the ghost dance itself, I should say a couple of words about that. Let's see. Here we go. So the ghost dance religion they were a series of religions, actually. It wasn't just one. They're called religious, they're sort of classified as religious revitalization movements. And that means that their function was to revitalize Native American culture and religion in the face of missionary and explorer and political cultural annihilation threats and warfare and everything else that was going on that they were suffering, essentially. So in the late 19th century, there was a Native American Paiute shaman called Wovoka, and he had a near-death experience, and he came back and he told his people, if we do this dance, if we revitalize our culture through this dance and commune with the ancestors in the other world, we can kind of push back on this foreign influence and the damage that the Europeans are doing to our culture. The Indian Shaker Church was also founded on the near-death experience of a guy named John Slocum, who was also a Native American. And what's interesting about them is that the Indian Shakers considered themselves to be Christians, but because John Slocum returned from the dead with his personal testimony of the other world, they valued that above the Bible. They didn't see the Bible as a source of revelation. They saw the narratives of their own people as the true revelations. But nevertheless, they still worshipped Christ and participated in Christian rituals. And there's examples going back further, like into the 17th, 18th centuries, where French missionaries would come over to North America and try to convert different Native American tribes and tell them about hellfire and damnation and eternal fire that people suffer. And the Native Americans would say, "No, we don't believe you, because this particular guy of our society died and went there and told us what happens, and it's nothing like what you're saying. So why should we believe you? Why should we believe your Bible, which was written thousands of years ago, when we were just there, a couple of years ago?" So they really prioritized experience over dogma and over teaching, which again, to me, I think that's probably a universal human trait. I think if any of us were maybe raised in a particular religion and then had a near-death experience that countered some of that religion, I think most of us would probably go with the personal experience over the dogma that we've been taught. But what's interesting also about the ghost dance religions is that they were, it wasn't just about one person having the experience and then changing. They wanted to bring the experience and the transformational effects of it into the community. And they were instructed to do this by the deities in the other world. So, for example, they would tell them, take this dance back to your people. And it was a way of sort of democratizing the afterlife for them, because they would get into these trance states by dancing for hours and hours and hours and taking drugs as well, peyote or whatever else, until they collapsed. And having sort of incubated the idea in their minds that when I collapse, I'm going to go to the other world and have an NDE, sure enough, they would have them. Whether it was, real or not is not for me to judge, but they were in an unconscious state and having these visionary sorts of experiences. So it was a way of, making these experiences accessible to everybody and hoping to bring about this kind of mass transformation of the culture without actually having everybody die. And here is another example. This is the dreamer prophet cult from the guy dressed in white. His name was Smallhala. He had a near-death experience and brought back another experiential type of religion, but their goal was to have dreams about the afterlife and to commune with spirits and gods in the other world that way. Now, just to throw another monkey wrench in the works, the situation in a lot of African societies is very different, because they didn't valorize personal experience. They didn't have this kind of vision quest type tradition that Native Americans did, which also was in the Pacific. In the Pacific, they were very open to all kinds of afterlife related phenomena, deathbed visions, shamanic journeying, NDEs. They weren't like afraid of ghost spirits or anything like that. But in a lot of sub-Saharan African communities, there was a real focus on the ancestors, still remaining on Earth, like in the forests or in the rivers, these kind of animistic ideas that they're still there. And either they're going to be benevolent and do positive things for our society, or they're mischievous and we have to placate them in some way. And one of the things that these evil spirits would do is reanimate the dead, and bring them back to life as these kind of mischief-making zombie type creatures. So if you think about, we know that near-death experiences happen in some of these African societies. If somebody had a near-death experience and came back to life, they're not seen as somebody who came back to life. They're seen as somebody who's reanimated by sorcery or witchcraft. So that means going back to the idea of different kinds of resuscitation technologies, or how many people are going to come back to life in a given culture. In these African societies, they weren't given a chance to come back to life and talk about whatever near-death experience they might have had, because when they would come back, they would be stoned to death or silenced in some other way, because understandably, if it's a walking corpse who's going to start causing mischief or killing people, then we can't have that walking around the community. So while this may not be ideal for the person who came back to life, it's perfectly understandable from the context of those other kinds of religious beliefs. So what's interesting about this is there's a very, very clear correlation between the occurrence of near-death experiences in early African societies and in Native American. So in Native American societies, I found something like 70 examples of NDEs. I found around 40 examples of them overtly saying, we know about the afterlife because so-and-so went there, that they got their afterlife beliefs from these experiences. In the African societies, I found like maybe not even a dozen, 8 or 10 descriptions of NDEs, usually in the context of it being some sort of aberration. There was one example of a woman who was a human sacrifice victim, and she came back to life. And she said, I went to the other world and I met the gods, and they said, they sacrificed you naked. This is indecent. How dare you appear in front of us? You need to go back and get dressed and then come back. So she said, she told the story to her people. They let her go get dressed. And then she says, okay, now I'm ready. And they kill her again. And it was just normal. It was just perfectly accepted. And then also in Africa, they would bind them hand and foot when they buried people in order to prevent them from actually coming back. They'd pile stones on top of the grave. And when old people reached the perceived end of their life and they thought, my life on earth is done, they would willingly go, abandon themselves in the forest and wait to starve or be eaten by hyenas or whatever. And missionaries or explorers would come along and say, you know what, we have medicine that can cure this. We can save you. And they would just say, no, my time's over. It's just time for me to go. So very few opportunities for people to come back and talk about a near-death experience. So I got almost obsessed with trying to find more examples from the African literature. And I looked at probably even more than I did of Native Americans. And I found 2 examples of them saying, we got our afterlife beliefs from people who had been there. So it's really exceptions that prove the rule. Now, just diverting from that for a minute and going to the idea of whether these experiences are true or not. There was I mentioned in the Chinese example, these revelations that the Chinese near-death experiences in the 7th century BCE were given, and that they came true, these political predictions. There was in the I'll mention this one first. This is a Mormon pioneer named Walter Monson. And let me find this, because this is a really interesting one. In 1923, he had a near-death experience in Utah in a hospital. And let's see. There you go. So he described how he's in a Mormon hospital in Utah, and he describes his consciousness slipping away. And he says, I awoke in full possession of all my faculties in another sphere of life. I stood apart from my body and I looked at it. I noticed that its eyes were partly closed, and that the chin had dropped. I was now without pain, and the joy of freedom that I felt and the peace of mind that came over me were the sweetest sensations I have ever experienced. I lost all sense of space and time. The law of gravitation had no hold on me, which is a great description of that near-death experience, disembodied state that we've read about, in lots of modern NDEs. Then and this is where it gets interesting about the revelations and the evidential part. He says, as I turned my head in the direction I intended to go, I saw my little daughter, Elna, who had died 21 years before. She was more mature than when she passed away, which is interesting. She grew up in the other world and was most beautiful to my eyes, so full of life, intelligence, and sweetness. As she came towards me, she raised her right hand and said, "No, go back, Papa. I want Richard first. Then Grandma must come, and then Mama is coming, and then you." The next thing I knew, my body was gasping for breath. I felt my heart start bumping, and I was conscious of the coldness leaving my body. All the numbness left me, and the warmth returned, and he came back to life. After he revived, his son Richard was mentioned by his daughter in the afterlife, said to him, "Daddy, you're not going to die, are you?" And after receiving this message from his daughter, Walter Monson is unable to keep from crying, and he starts crying as he's telling his son, "No, Richard, it's not my turn," because that's what his daughter told him. A week after he returned to life, Richard died, his little boy. Right before he died, he had a deathbed vision where he saw Elna, his sister in the other world, and she told him the circumstances of his father's return to life. She explained the whole thing to him just as she explained it to their father. And she even told Richard, you have to die first, basically. And so Richard said to his father, "You promised that I could go to the spirit world. Now I know why you cried when I said, 'You're not going to die, are you?'" So he was so impressed, Walter Monson, with the value of his son's words. He wrote, "How he knew that I wept because I had been told by Elna that he was going to go first, and that my coming back was equivalent to a promise that he might precede me to the great beyond, can only be explained through knowledge given him from Elna herself." So in other words, his son knew the reason he was crying because his sister told him so, as explained to Walter Monson in the afterlife. Poor Richard knew nothing of the circumstance of what I saw and heard while my spirit was separated from my body at the hospital. So as if that's not interesting enough, Richard dies. Walter Monson's mother dies less than 2 months later. His wife dies after 6 years, fulfilling all the prophetic words of his daughter, Elna, in the other world. So, that brings up all kinds of questions. For one thing, are these things destined? How did his daughter in the other world predict that? How did she know that it was going to happen? Is there some weird time thing in the other world where she can see the future? Could that order of deaths had ever been changed? We don't know any of that, but it's one of those things that brings up a lot more questions than is even resolvable. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about this whole idea of revelations being true in the other world, because we have the Chinese example, we have Walter Monson's example of this predictive information coming true, and lots of other examples throughout the text. But then we have a really interesting study by Kenneth Ring, who is another kind of key NDE researcher. And in the 80s, he did a study where he found that a lot of people, this is a study in the United States, he found that a lot of people who had NDEs had these prophetic visions, and that they were coming back and saying very similar things. They were saying things like, the world is going to have a massive upheaval. It's not going to end, but there's going to be a catastrophic event. And that's going to lead to a sort of decline of society, degeneration. And eventually, though, it's going to correct itself and we're going to enter a golden age. And that's going to happen sometime around 1988, 1990. this was repeated multiple times, and then unbeknownst to him and unbeknownst to her, a scholar in the UK, Margot Gray, she did a similar study and found the exact same thing in the UK, people saying all the same things. Obviously, none of those predictions came true, and these people experienced them as divine revelations. We haven't had a complete, collapse of society. We may have been close a couple times. We haven't entered a golden age. None of this happened in 1988 or 1990s. So why some people seem to be getting true revelations and some people seem to be getting false revelations is another one of these very mysterious things about NDEs. And unfortunately, I can't just give you a tidy answer to that. It's just kind of throwing up another mysterious phenomenon that surrounds these kinds of experiences.
Gregory, may I comment on that?
Sure.
You notice with Monson's prediction, there was no time frame. Like
Right.
his daughter didn't say Richard will die, at this time, and your mother will die at this time and your wife will die at that time. I think it's very hard, even when the predictions are correct, it's very hard to pinpoint time.
Mm-hmm.
So it could, I'm not saying that those other predictions were right, but I wouldn't entirely rule them out because of a time factor.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, he just said the succession in which they'll die, but didn't say when. But I thought what was interesting about Kenneth Ring's analysis of this is he linked it to the idea of when a society is in crisis, it has these kind of apocalyptic leanings. This is demonstrated going way back to early Christianity, right, or even earlier, where the world's going to end and there's going to be a golden age. And so he thought it was just like a sort of collective consciousness thing, that this is just where people's anxieties and fears are coming out in their NDEs. And what I thought was really interesting about that is how much it mirrored what was going on with the Native American examples I talked about and the religious revitalization movements, because those movements all started because they were afraid of their culture collapsing and losing their livelihood and their land and their resources and everything. Right. So they were having these sort of NDEs that were also telling them things like, some of them were the dead are going to come back to Earth and rejoin us. And some of them were we're going to enter a golden age. So I tend to think that it's kind of a psychological component of what's going on.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah. It's a bit Freudian, but I think there's probably some truth in it. Right. And then as if all that's not enough, I then had to look at what mediums say about the afterlife, and how they describe what it's like in the other world, because I wanted to compare that to descriptions of the afterlife in near-death experiences, because there's with a lot of the psychical research that happened, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were these mediums that convinced a lot of educated, skeptical, scientific people, like Oliver Lodge, who was a great pioneer in radio, Frederick Myers, William James, American founder of American psychology, really well-educated, high standard people, who completely believed, or at least leaned towards believing, that mediumship was real and that these mediums were actually communicating with the dead. So what I did was look at, I kind of found the most well-regarded mediums who produced the most evidence, people like Leonora Piper, Geraldine Cummings, Gladys Osborne Leonard, Eileen Garrett, these kinds of people. And I looked at their, I didn't look so much at the evidence because that's been done by everybody, but I looked at what they said about the afterlife, because on the assumption that, or on the principle rather, that if what they said about, you know, you can find, you know, they did all these tests. Like, for example, they did these book tests where they would say, there's a certain, I'm thinking of a certain page of a certain book, and the medium would be able to identify what that was, or they would put together certain kinds of messages from different mediums to different people, and they'd only make sense when they were brought together. And they would give evidence like where things could be found and all this kind of thing. So I thought if those things were true, then maybe what they're saying about the afterlife could also possibly be true. So I looked at some of those texts, and sure enough, a lot of them are very similar to near-death experiences. They involve things like, you know, traveling to the other world outside your body, meeting deceased relatives, beings of light, different levels and different, you know, bardos, sub-experiences or intermediate states or whatever, all kind of familiar with NDEs. But what they also featured was a lot of really quite overt racism, very much from the point of view of, you know, Middle England, Victorian, Edwardian, culturally isolated people who were used to having the world in a very particular sort of way. So they would say things like, there are servants in the other world. They remain our servants because they're not mentally evolved enough to want to become emancipated. So that's their, you know, their wishful thinking way of wanting to imagine the other world is still having their servants, basically. They would say things like there's 7 levels to Summerland, which is what they sometimes called heaven. And the higher up you go, the lighter your skin is. They would say Japanese people have a certain segregated area, Black people have a certain segregated area. They're all equal, but none of us have to see them. You know, is the message really. But eventually they will all come to Christ, and that's when everyone will kind of come together. So it's this, you know, religious intolerance and judgmentalism and classism and racism, essentially, which is not surprising. I mean, it was a major characteristic of upper class English society at the time, and it's obviously a reflection of their beliefs. But the point of all this is that if a medium who is producing evidential information and supposedly getting truth from spirits in the other world, why are they describing a racially hierarchical afterlife? And is this objective for everybody? If she can get clear information about one thing, why can't she get clear information about everything? So to me, that's a little bit troubling. Here's just a kind of fun example of a depiction of the afterlife from back then. On the left, you have a road leading to hell. You could see burning buildings in the background, and there's people fighting in the foreground and engaging in commerce and hitting each other and whatever. And then on the right, you've got Jesus crucified and the path that leads up to heaven. And all along the way, you've got the Bible verses that justify what's going to go on in each part. And of course, everybody's white because was what their daily life is like. So in some ways, I'm not judging them for that. I'm just saying that if you're presenting the afterlife as a universal afterlife for everybody, it's not inclusive. You know, they're not presenting that. They're presenting it for English people, but basically preserving the inequality of the status quo of Victorian times. So I then also wanted to look at children who remember past lives. Some of you might know the work of Ian Stevenson, who is a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia. And he studied a lot of children who would spontaneously start talking about a previous life, saying things like, I want to go see my other mom. And they would remember where they worked in their former personality, or they would remember how to get to their previous house, and they'd be able to give directions on how to get there. And what's interesting about that is, again, I didn't study those evidential features. I didn't try to, match up people with any actual historical living person. What I did was look at their descriptions of the state between lives. So essentially, if somebody claims to be remembering their past personality, this child. Sometimes they start talking about it like as early as 2 or even 1 years old. Like as soon as they can talk, they're talking about these previous life memories. Some of them will say, I remember, being run over by a wagon, and I left my body, and I was trying to talk to people. I was trying to talk to my mom, and she wouldn't answer me. She couldn't hear me, and she couldn't see me. And then I floated around the village for a while, and then I saw my body in a coffin, and then I ascended from that body and went to the other world. And then I chose my new family. So essentially what those kids are describing is a near-death experience, but instead of coming back to their old body, which is dead, they're coming back to a new body. So it's this kind of intermediate life state. And there's a very famous reincarnation case, possibly the most famous one from India, of a girl named Shanti Devi. Even Gandhi got involved in this case, and Ian Stevenson wrote about it. But what's often not talked about in her case was her intermission state memories, the memory of her NDEs. So this was in 1930. At the age of 4, she started to talk about her previous parents and her previous life. A lot of these children have a real strong longing, a drive to go back and visit their previous parents. They really miss them, and they get really emotional about it. So that shows that it's not just something that they're spontaneously making up to get attention, because they're showing the emotions associated with the past people. And Ian Stevenson, when he researched this case in the 1980s, he found that she made 24 verified statements about her previous life, which is, that's pretty evidential stuff. But as far as her memory of her previous death, her previous, what would have been an NDE, what she said was, just before death, I felt a profound darkness, and after death, I saw a dazzling light. So, 2 of the most key NDE elements, darkness and light. Then and there, I knew that I had come out of my body in a vaporous form and that I was moving upwards. She was then met by 4 teenage boys who were dressed in saffron robes, which is very much not a Western, typical Western NDE. And this is a great example of how it's idiosyncratic, but it's also these basic elements. Then they have a rectangular vessel, she describes, of being 10 inches in diameter. And they put her soul into that vessel, and then they took it to the 3rd plane of the other world. They told her that those who aspired for a higher life, but who had committed fleshly wrong in this life, were dipped into the river before moving any higher. But then they proceeded to the 4th plane, where everything is open space, everything is full of light, smoothing and enlivening light, is how they described it. There she met more saints. These 4 teenagers she met turned out to be saints, who were brighter in appearance, and with them was the god Krishna. And Krishna was showing each person what would their afterlife would be like, what would be the condition in their future, is how she put it. She didn't recall much about what Krishna told her, but she did remember that he told her about what her new life on earth would be like, in her new incarnation. And he even told her house number 565, which was the address of her new identity. And that was how her soul was able to find her new parents. So these 4 saffron-robed teenage saints took her to a place that she described as a staircase where there was more very bright light. She sat there for a long time and then was taken into a dark room. She said there was a very bad smell coming from this room. Then she was made to lie down. She didn't feel any pain, passed into a state of unconsciousness. And at that moment, I saw a very brilliant light. And then soon after, she was, that's when she's reborn into her new identity. So I find that fascinating for 2 reasons. To me, the best evidence for an afterlife is from near-death experiences and from these children who remember past lives. And those descriptions from Shanti Devi, despite the obvious cultural stuff, to me are closer to near-death experiences than they are to the mediumship stuff, because they're so specific in what she's saying.
Gregory, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Has anybody ever done any work with the Dalai Lama about his transition time?
I don't know that anyone has. No, I
That's
don't
your
think so.
next book.
Yeah, if he would talk to me.
I'm sure he would.
Yeah,
He's really into science these days.
yeah, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know he's talked about, reincarnation in the previous succession of lives, but the intermissions, the Bardo states, I don't know if he's discussed that. And then there's the past life regression. This is not a picture of past life regression, but to me, it sort of encapsulates it because it's obviously a fake, very fake photograph, spirit photography. It's a Victorian thing where they would just clearly superimpose different photographs on the person whose reading they were giving. So this is allegedly, all of her ancestors or past personalities. So to me, the past life regression stuff of people like Michael Newton or Roger Wolger or Brian Weiss, it's really interesting. And I think it has a really valuable therapeutic quality to it. But evidentially, I'm not at all convinced by it. And I don't think that there's been any case that's been super convincing to me. And what's interesting about that is correspondingly, when people who have past life regression, when they remember the supposed intermediate state, the Bardo state between lives, it's much, much more detailed. I want to say fictionalized. I don't want to judge it too much, but it's very much more like a story and things like in the same way that the mediumship narratives are. There's this bureaucratic structure in the afterlife. Everything is set in a certain way. There's systems of learning and systems of progression, whereas NDEs and the children who remember past life states, they're much more mystical. They're just like, they're more free and open and cosmic, I guess. They're kind of sense of union and transcendence rather than I'm entering another world that's an idealized version of this world with just different kind of bureaucracy. So that's essentially where I came to with all this, thinking that some of these experiences seem more genuine to me than others, in the sense that they may correspond to an afterlife in different ways. Just to wrap up a couple of things. So taking this to the next level of despite all these differences and similarities, if we accept near-death experiences and at least the children who remember past lives as real phenomena that actually indicate an afterlife, what kind of afterlife could we even expect, given all these differences, and how could we even come up with a way of conceptualizing it? And to me, the best way to do that is the Buddhist idea, and it's also mirrored. There was a Oxford philosopher named H.H. Price, who was very interested in parapsychology, and he came up with what he called the mind-dependent afterlife. And it's very similar to Mahayana Buddhism, where essentially the way I look at it, they didn't have this terminology at the time, but the way I look at it is it's essentially like a lucid dream that's shared with other people who are also having a lucid dream. So you're co-creating the other world, and you're doing it with people who probably share some kind of cultural touchstones that you do. So so the afterlife is objective, but you're all sort of perceiving it and creating it in different ways. And this could even be extended to thinking of it in that there's maybe objective places or things in the afterlife, like we saw with the teepee village of the prophet Bianchi. Maybe we all go to this village, but Bianchi is going to see it as teepees, and I'm going to see it as I'm in San Diego right now, so maybe I would see it as a San Diego street, or maybe an African society would see it as whatever kind of architecture they have. So I look at it as a sort of projection idea, that we're projecting our symbolism over what is actually happening in an afterlife. And the reason I think that's sort of compelling is because of the differences and the similarities of near-death experiences. So as I said at the beginning, some people are going to see the being of light, and some people are going to walk along a road, and some people are going to go through a tunnel. The being of light is going to be seen as Jesus or the Buddha or Muhammad or whatever person, whatever that person's religious beliefs are. Atheists will just see it as a being of light. I saw this amazing light being. So I think we can believe in an afterlife in a rational way while also accepting all of these differences and similarities. And then just one final thing is the challenge to materialist science of all this, of the differences cross-culturally. You may have heard in the news in the last couple of years, well, a few years ago, the first one was about rats. The scientists measured the brains of rats as they were dying, and they detected a burst of brain activity right at the moment of death of these rats. And then they replicated it on a human last year. I don't think they did it even in reference to the rats specifically, but they were able to basically monitor the brain of a person who was dying, and record what was going on in the brain. And they saw the same thing happen as with the rats. There was this burst of brain activity at a point where they did not expect it. They thought the brain would be, winding down at that point, essentially.
Because the heart had already stopped, right?
Right. The heart had already stopped.
Yeah.
Exactly. So being scientists, they said, this accounts for the life review and the near-death experience. What they didn't account for was cross-culturally, life reviews are extremely rare. So if life reviews in Western NDEs are caused by a burst of brain activity, why isn't a burst of brain activity in other societies causing a life review? So my way of thinking, they've explained nothing except that there's a burst of brain activity at the end of life. So while a lot of people are uncomfortable with the differences between NDEs and people want them to be the same everywhere, and you still read that all the time, and a lot of time when I do interviews, people will say, isn't it amazing that near-death experiences are all the same around the world? And I have to say, they're not. They're the same in the sense that they occur around the world and that they have a few common threads. But people want to believe that they're the same because they want it to be this, cozy, easily explained afterlife that they were brought up believing in. So it's a challenge to that, but then it's also a challenge to the materialist science, which I think can also kind of, in a way, give comfort to people who want to keep believing in an afterlife in a way that I think is rational and reasonable. So yeah, I think that's probably all I have to say, and it's all kind of wrapped up in this book. If you want to take a look.
So it's a very interesting book. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that if anyone wants to ask a question, either have your video on or type your question in the chat, okay? One thing I wanted to address, you mentioned in your book, in various places, you talk about spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you're familiar at all with Spiritism.
No, not really.
Okay, this is something I would recommend you look into, because it was the founder of Spiritism was Allan Kardec, who was a professor of science and math at the Sorbonne University in Paris in the mid-1800s. And what Spiritism teaches, and he did a lot of research. Being a man of science, he was originally very skeptical about mediumship, and which was all the rage at the time because of the spiritualist movement.
Right.
He was very skeptical, but then he did a tremendous amount of research, and with many mediums around the world, and found that he was finally convinced because of the consistency of the answers that they gave. He formulated a very large number of questions, very specific questions, not just about the afterlife and not so much about near-death experience. In fact, I don't remember any questions on near-death experience, but but a lot on the afterlife, the spirit world, how it connects with our world, and how the soul leaves the body, and all kinds of specific things. And the answers were by and large so consistent that he was finally convinced and decided to write a book, or publish a book, actually, because it was the spirits who answered all the questions, so he couldn't really claim to have written it. He just posed the questions, and through the mediums. He was not a medium himself. And the answers that came through are all in the book, so it's in a question and answer format. So one of the things that I would say about the mediumship research that you did is that mediums attract spirits through affinity, and if they're it's not surprising that someone, as you said, who is in a culture that believes, that is very racist and classist and all of that, would attract a spirit who is of the same genre and of the same belief system. So I don't think that proves that it wasn't really a spirit. I think it just proves that they are attracting like spirits, you see. And they would be lower spirits, of course. They're not evolved spirits, because even in that culture, I'm sure there were people who were evolved enough to know that that was wrong, right?
Absolutely.
They just weren't attracting those spirits. So,
In fact, there's a great essay by William James about human immortality, and I think it was written in 1896, something like that. And he's basically berating his audience, because it was based on a lecture, and he's berating them by saying, the reason that people don't believe in an afterlife anymore is because they don't want to share it with people of other races. And he's, he wrote a lot about things like that. So I think that's totally possible. And it also even fits in with the idea that can co-create our own afterlife with other spirits, because if the communicating spirit, the control or whatever, is in an afterlife with other people of like-mindedness, they might be actually co-creating this secluded, segregated sort of world.
Exactly. And even the report about the servants, that could have actually been going on in that dimension, this other dimension, because you could have servants who think that that's their place, and I mean, you don't know. I mean, I don't know, but
I guess what I would say in response to that, though, is I guess since the near-death experience was kind of my my yardstick of comparison for everything else, that doesn't compare well with a near-death experience. Like nobody says, they learned their lot in life and to stay in their place, and it's always about
that was a mediumship. That was a mediumship account, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah, it was. But that's what I'm saying, that when we compare the two, if we're judging the mediumship account by near-death experience on the grounds that the near-death experience has better evidence, is kind of a So
I agree with you. That would not be evidence for near-death experience. Gregory, before we start other questions, do you want to stop your share so we can see you better?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a quick question. Now, you have because of your interests, you have a kind of a broad perspective of what is happening in these fields of study. So my comment would be number one, I was not sure I understood why there is this tremendous debate between religious studies and theological studies on what is related to near-death experience, consciousness studies, or the resuscitation medicine. If you can talk about that. And the second thing is that if you can think in terms of doing a prediction, if you look at from Moody's time, you're talking about 30 years, and there is this tremendous expansion of information that is being shared across the world. We didn't have this 30, 40 years ago. The field did not exist. What do you think would be where are we going in 5 years, in 10 years, from a broad perspective?
Within near-death studies, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of accepting the possibility of a continuity or existence beyond this physical body.
Yeah, it's so hard to say. I mean, I think in the 19th century, they thought they were right on the doorstep, you know, at any time that they'd probably be shocked that we're not there yet.
Mhm.
So, you know, so much of science is geared towards disproving it. So, and or at least interpreting whatever evidence they have in a negative way, like the dying brain thing I mentioned, the burst of activity at the end of consciousness. There are people like Sam Parnia and Pim van Lommel who are doing these experiments where they were putting symbols on the tops of equipment in hospitals,
Yeah,
hoping that the person would float out of their bodies and they would be able to see that. I mean, I think that's it would be amazing if they actually got a hit on one of those.
I thought they had. I thought they did.
No, Sam
It has
Parnia
not-
was, sorry?
It has not worked yet.
Hasn't worked.
No, but
No.
what he did do is he was able to pinpoint, and this is another problem with science. He didn't achieve what he set out to do, but what he did achieve was still pretty amazing, and it didn't get any attention. He was able to pinpoint a particular person's NDE, a certain observation he had of what was going on in the operating room,
Mhm.
by like a timestamp basically of the guy's progression in his death. So
Right.
and that was when he was actually dead. So he was able to show that happened at that time. But it didn't get much attention for some reason.
But on the issue of religious studies versus
Theology.
theology,
Yeah. Yeah, that's essentially if you look at religious studies as a field that doesn't study our own religions, we don't study as religious people. We study like anthropologists or sociologists. So then theology, it's the practice of studying your own religion by definition. So you could be a Buddhist theologian studying Buddhism, or whatever. But from the perspective of religious studies, or it's actually study of religions now. They keep changing the name. It used to be called comparative religion, then it was religious studies, and now it's the study of religions. They have to keep refining it. But it's, in a way, it makes sense because there's the history of religious studies was to study other people's religions in relation to Christianity, which was like the default.
Like more of an anthropological study.
Well, yeah, but it became more like an anthropological thing. But at first, it was this, Christianity was at the top, and it was all kind of seeing how all these religions led to Christianity, as if they're not relevant anymore. And so there was this notion called essentialism that they would talk about, that basically all religions have the same essence and they're all the same, but they all lead to Christianity at the top. So they're trying to avoid that, but in doing that, they throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying there is nothing essentially the same about religions, and that includes experience. Everything is determined by culture. Some will even say everything's determined by language. Language creates culture. Therefore, there's no such thing as any kind of experience that we can call religious, because it's all culturally generated. So, so by being default atheists, or if not atheists, at least putting all your beliefs aside and being this, objective, robotic analyst, you're not supposed to look at anything that might be true in religions. And that includes they don't even acknowledge that there can be a kind of experience that can lead to religious beliefs around the world, because they don't even think that religious beliefs are similar. They don't even think there's a concept of religion around the world. There's a sort of movement in religious studies to not call it religious studies anymore, because that's a Western category that we're imposing on these other kinds of cultures. So it's complicated.
No, thank you very much. I mean, it was really, really interesting.
If I could
Appreciate your
add,
knowledge. Yeah.
at least for Catholicism, You said it's the study of your own religion. It's deeper than that. In Catholicism, at least, it's the study of religion by someone who truly believes in it already.
Right.
So that from the point of view of religious studies, that's already biased. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
a big distinction.
Yeah.
Can I ask something real quick?
Sure.
I don't want to co-opt someone. With this business about the people seeing their body and all that, I was under the impression that at least in some cases, they also see what people around them are doing.
Right.
I've seen claims of, in some cases, they see what somebody in another room is doing. And I understand that they call that autoscopy.
Yeah.
I see conflicting reports about that. And I was, you kind of already answered the question about they're not seeing the messages that the researchers are putting up there.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the reports, is it conflicting? I mean, even now we thought that they did see one of the messages. So
Right.
I'd like your take on that. And then I want to add a bit of information that might be interesting.
Okay. Yeah, there have been lots and lots of reports like that. There's a famous case of Pam Reynolds in the 70s, I guess. And she had a near-death experience while all the blood was drained from her head and her brain was frozen, in order to perform this brain surgery. No question that she was, had no ability to hear or see or anything. She also happened to have perfect pitch, and she was able to identify the note of the bone saw that sawed into her skull. She woke up B flat minor, whatever it was. And she saw all kinds of things going on in the operating room. There was a nurse, a woman named Maria who supposedly floated out of her hospital room and saw a red tennis shoe on the roof, and that was later confirmed. So lots of stories like that, but the skeptical scientific definition of them is anecdotal, because they haven't been able to repeat them in a laboratory setting. And that's what the putting symbols on top of the machine is.
Although if they claim they saw someone doing something in another room, wouldn't they be able to verify that from that person?
They would, but there's always same with the children who remember past life studies. There's always some way that they can explain it in other terms. So
I can understand that.
She, her ears were taped up, but there was maybe a little gap where she could have heard something, or she overheard it from another room, which is, almost just as speculative as the person saying they actually did see the shoe on the roof, because a lot of times they have to go to such extremes to make it seem like the person got the information in some other way.
Yes,
and that's the same
I've
with medium.
seen that.
Yeah, and it's the same with mediumship, actually, when some of these mediumship studies where the medium would get such precise information about, somebody's grandfather or whatever, who they never met before. They never met the person sitting there. And the only other explanation is that the medium has access to, some universal consciousness and is able to pick out accurate information to the person sitting there, as if that's supposed to be more believable than
plausible.
More plausible than actually a
And I'll just quickly tell you this, so I don't want to hog up the time. I went a couple of years ago to a panel discussion at the New York Academy of Sciences. Sam Parnia was the chair, and they had a doctor and they had a psychologist and all that. The doctor was from Wisconsin, and he basically repeated he had this one case where, again, the patient upon recovery could tell everything that he did and all that. But the addition was this: when this doctor was working on him, he was thinking some very unkind thoughts about the guy who was supposed to be there. And this doctor claimed that this patient told him not only what he was doing, but what he was thinking.
Wow.
And this was a doctor from Wisconsin. Yeah. It was mind-blowing for me. I wrote to him because I wanted to get more details, but he never wrote back. And you're right, Sam Parnia, he thinks there's something to it, but he's not sure. And he did have those unsuccessful experiments.
Yeah.
But it was New York Academy of Sciences. That was amazing.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I find interesting about that is Well, I mean, it's an amazing story, but the scientists who are actually doing the work, like Sam Parnia, Pim van Lommel, Peter Fenwick in the UK, Bruce Grayson, they all started out as skeptical, and then through their hands-on research, they either came to be believers in NDEs or at least open-minded about them and think that there's something going on there. Whereas the people who are the most critical, the deepest skeptics, are not doing that kind of work. They're just kind of theorizing from afar. So to me, that's an important factor, really. And I wonder if they would do the actual work, if they would also be changing their minds.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
I enjoyed Sam Parnia's book, Erasing Death.
Yeah.
Good book.
It is, yeah. And Bruce Grayson's new book, After, is also excellent.
I haven't read that yet.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Just want to say thank you. It was
Uh-huh.
excellent.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
We have a few more minutes. I wanted to say, Jim Tucker, when we had our center in Boulder, we flew him in to give a talk, and he was there. And one of the things that he mentioned, that you also mentioned in your book, is that a vast majority of these cases of children who remember previous lives, they died a violent death in their previous life.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because so many of them reincarnate very quickly, which is not unusual when it's that kind of abrupt, unexpected kind of death. And so they actually don't cross over all the way. They remain earthbound and they come back rather quickly.
Right.
And so their memory is fresh in a sense. I mean, assuming the consciousness continues, right? And some of them more fascinating cases in Jim Tucker's book were the ones that had they would come back with birthmarks which corresponded to the way they died. Yeah, because the memory was so fresh that it would register on the body somehow.
Yeah. One of Ian Stevenson's books, which is I think it's out of print and difficult to find, but I think the whole thing is about birthmarks. Yeah.
That would be fascinating. Yeah, there was that one account of an American boy, because most of these, as you mentioned in your book, most of these cases come from cultures that believe in reincarnation, but this was an American boy whose parents did not believe in reincarnation. And when he was about 2.5, 3 years old, he was misbehaving and he wasn't listening to his mother. And his mother said, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to spank you. And he said, when you were little, you misbehaved and I never spanked you. And she said, what are you talking about? And he said, I was your daddy. And her father had died. He was a policeman, and he had died. He was shot in the back trying to prevent a robbery in a store. And the bullet went in through his back and went through his pulmonary valve and exited through his chest. And when the boy was born 18 months later, he had a small cylindrical birthmark on his back corresponding to the entry wound of the bullet. He had to have surgery on his pulmonary valve because it wasn't functioning properly. And he had a more jagged birthmark on his chest corresponding to the exit wound, but they never put it together. They never, so he said, I was your daddy, so he had come back very quickly. And then, when Jim Tucker went out to see him, they showed him a class picture of, like 3rd grade or something like that. And he immediately pointed to this little boy and said, that's me right there. And so there was a lot of things, like he said to his mother, don't you remember you had a kitten and you called him Boston and I called him Boss, and just a lot of things like that, little incidentals. So it was fascinating with birthmarks.
Yeah. And also, I think Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson as well, they found a few cases of xenoglossy, which is speaking languages that the person doesn't actually know,
Yes.
and is associated with the past life. None
Yeah.
of them seem to be, it's not like they suddenly start speaking fluently, but just the fact that they even know a few words and their correct meanings is pretty amazing.
Right. Well, there was a very famous Brazilian medium who died, I think maybe it was 2003, named Chico Xavier.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've never heard of him, you could look him up. Xavier is spelled X-A, like Xavier, right?
Right. Okay.
And in fact, there's a movie on his life that you can see by the same name. And he would get letters for people. He would sit in his home and he would just start, he did automatic writing. And
right.
So he would start writing, furiously, and he would just sit there like this, and his hand would be going a mile a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be letters to people, loved ones from deceased people. Right.
Yeah.
And so periodically he would gather, he would have a gathering of people come, and he would have a stack of letters in front of him, and the people were there in hopes of getting a letter.
Right.
And they would, he would read the first letter, and the letters would be, often the whole letter was in the handwriting of the person who was deceased. And if it wasn't the whole letter, it was at least the signature, right? There's a million stories about him. And he's so recent, so it's really fascinating to read about him. And the letters would be very specific, like tell Aunt Matilda that the cake that she was looking for is not in that freezer or whatever. And, they were very specific, and he would read the letter and the person would just come up tearfully and take the letter. And it was very reassuring to their loved ones,
Wow.
Yeah. So
can I just mention, that reminds me, in your picture of the seance, the writing, what was that?
Oh yeah, that was automatic writing.
Got it.
Again. Yeah, that down in the corner. That's an example of automatic writing while the medium was in a trance.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And sometimes the letter would be in a different language that he didn't speak,
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there's the argument of, the cumulative evidence might help to outweigh the fact that a lot of the evidence might not be strictly scientifically valid or replicable. And that's sometimes how I feel. There's so many reports like this and so many of these things that make you just, drop your jaw, like the story that you just said, that there's I don't know what's going on, but there's something going on.
Yeah. Well, he channeled like 450 books in his life.
Wow.
And there's just so many stories, about him that are fascinating. But that would take a whole other presentation, I think.
Yeah. And another interesting, I've been editing a book, I'm putting together a book on William James and his writings and psychical research. And what's so interesting about that, going back to someone's question earlier, what I realized was he's writing about hypnotism in journals like the Journal for Society of Psychical Research, and phantom limb syndrome, where people still feel limbs that have been amputated. And at that time, that was parapsychology. That was unexplained phenomena. And now we acknowledge it as that's a neurophysiological weirdness going on.
Yeah.
And hypnotism is fully explainable. So I just wonder, what about today's parapsychology is just tomorrow's science?
Yeah. There's a famous scientist who said something to that effect. I can't remember who it was now. A quote that I read recently.
Right.
Georgina put in the chat, thank you. It was a fascinating presentation and discussion. And
can I just ask Gregory, when that book you anticipate coming out, that new book?
The William James one?
Yeah.
It'll be early this year, probably before summer, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and it's called Mind Dust and White Crows. The
I'm sorry,
psychical
could you repeat that?
Mind Dust and White Crows, the
Okay.
psychical research of William James.
Thank you.
Great. That'll be something to look forward to.
I had a quick question.
Okay.
When you were talking about atheists, you said that they had a not so much of a subjective kind of picture of the afterlife or belief system from their culture. But they had a similar experience of maybe as they were dying. Was there anything beyond that with people that were atheists?
Yeah, I mean, atheist NDEs tend to be, fairly consistent with other Western people's NDEs. So they'll describe leaving the body, going through darkness, seeing light and deceased relatives, and those kind of cosmic consciousness feelings, feeling oneness with everything. And then the being of light they will meet, and all they will say is, I felt this incredible love radiating. I felt this all-embracing acceptance and welcoming feeling and whatever. And then I was told I had to go back to my body or whatever. They just don't say I met Jesus. And I think most NDE researchers think that whatever that entity or being or phenomenon is most likely the same thing. And it's just being seen as Jesus by Christians and seen as a being of light, a loving being of light by atheists, and Krishna by Hindus or whatever.
Thank you.
And it's interesting too, because there's examples of atheists having their beliefs changed, going back to the whole experiential source hypothesis. There's a famous philosopher named A.J. Ayer, materialist philosopher, who basically spent his life, saying there's no God. And then he had a near-death experience, and he came back and he said, I'm going to have to rewrite all my books and change my opinions because I saw a divine being. He kind of recanted a little bit later. He wasn't quite comfortable with it, but that was his initial statement. And it also transformed him. His wife said he's so much nicer since he died. So it has these, transformational effects on people, whether they believe in them or not.
Are you familiar with Jenny Cockell? Her
The
story.
name sounds really familiar.
She's British, and she had spontaneous memories of previous lives.
Right.
And one in particular that started when she was a little girl, and then she remembered it later in life as well, which had to do with this little Irish village.
Yeah.
Where she was a mother, and she had died after the birth of her sixth child, maybe 6 or 7 or maybe even 8, and she felt so terrible at leaving her children, especially because her husband was an abusive alcoholic.
Right.
And so she spontaneous, it wasn't induced, it was spontaneous memories. And they became more and more insistent, more and more vivid. She drew a map of the village. She knew where everything was. They went to a cartologist, I guess, and they found this village on the map of Ireland on the coast. And she flies out there, and she reunites her children. It was really quite she presented for us. In fact, you could, if you wanted to, you could. Her presentation is on our YouTube channel.
Okay, great.
Jenny Cockell. It was an interview. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gregory. This has been so fascinating and so much thought-provoking stuff that you've shared with us this evening. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you also for those of you who attended. And I think this Saturday is we have an astrologer who's Rebecca Hirsch, and she's going to be talking to us about the 2023 and some of the energies happening. So, all right, well, thank you again, and good luck on your continued research.
Thank you
Be
too.
looking forward to following that.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Okay. Good night.